segment, and Jane is well known and loved in our town. So that was wonderful. Of course, you are a minister in Des Moines, but you do come up here to Second Baptist Church. That is the truth, isn't it?
Yes, I come up periodically. Absolutely.
Okay. And I do want to ask you a question, kind of a broad question, because I always, in fact, this is kind of my religion day. I had a Presbyterian minister and a Catholic on with me earlier today. And I always want to know how Christians should respond to a world that is becoming non-Christian, at least in my eyes. So in against the background of some turmoil, and frankly, racial turmoil that we have in our country, what should be the proper Christian response, do you believe?
I think first of all, thank you for having me on your show, good sir. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and a huge shout out to all of the people over over in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and thank you to Sherry Washington for definitely continuously connecting us and putting us together. I think first, Mike, what we have to do is we have to go back and we have to remember what was the whole reason of why we are talking about a man named Jesus. Mm-hmm. When we talk about this whole Christianity thing, Jesus, you never saw him in the Bible discriminating against the Jews, against the women, against the Palestinians, against the Muslims, against the Buddhists, the Hindus. You never saw him going against anything, but all of a sudden you have this Christian ideology, and there's so many different facets of it. You have Catholicism, you have the Baptist doctrine, the Church of God in Christ, you have apostolic doctrine, you have Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist. And so you have all of these different doctrines now that have stemmed from this thing called Christianity. And so what we have to remember is we have to go back to the reason on why we as Christians say that we are. Because I don't necessarily believe, Mike, that the world is turning non-Christian. I just believe that folks are waking up to the identity of what is around them and what is happening, and they're trying to adapt to what is happening. There's a lot. We are literally, Mike, in a mental health crisis. That's honestly where we at. And people who have been praying about it, and people who've been calling and asking questions. I had a conversation the other day, and somebody said, "Rob, I prayed, but it seemed like nothing happened." And I had to remind them that if you pray for a job, you can't just sit on the couch and just hope that the job falls on your lap, right?
No, sir.
The Bible tells us that faith without works is dead.
Yes, sir.
And so now we have, Mike, we have an opportunity. COVID-19 did a lot for our country. And our condolences to everybody who we've lost and our family members who are grieving. But one thing that it did do is it woke us up to the disparities that are happening in our country. And Jesus was about helping the poor. And until we get on board, Mike, until we get on board with helping those who are least fortunate, helping those without, helping those who are oppressed, then we will find ourselves in this same predicament. Because somebody, I did a sermon the other day that the world needs a new Messiah. And what I meant by that is you have to be the Jesus in the room. You have to be the light in the room because he was the light of the world. You have to shine that light through you. And so that's my whole point to people today, Brother Mike, is be the Jesus in the room. And that is where your Christendom and your Christianity will shine.
We talked a little earlier today, both with a Presbyterian minister, with Jane Burleson, with Joe Coleman, a well-known Catholic man in our area. We talked about the early civil rights movement, and the modern civil rights movement started right after the Second World War. A lot of people know who Ralph Abernathy is, and certainly Dr. Martin Luther King. But their message was through the 50s. Mm-hmm. That white Christians were not living up to the tenets of their faith by the way they treated black people.
Correct.
And that as they continued to preach that message, the truth of it began to sink in with white Christian ministers. and they began to address their congregation in more or less the same way. We are not living up to our Christian faith by keeping black people in a second class citizenship. And the world changed through their Christian ministry. I still believe that is the most powerful period in our history. There have been many, many, many powerful moments in our nation's history. But that mostly peaceful transition, I know there were people killed in the civil rights movement, and it was awful. And there was a lot of violence against civil rights workers back in those days. But I still think, for the most part, a bunch of peaceful Christian people led the way to where we are today. But I know you don't necessarily think the same as I do here, but it doesn't seem like we have a Christian influence, or much of a Christian influence, today with our civil rights struggle. Am I right or wrong?
This is interesting because what we're looking at right now is you when Martin Luther King was there, you had this faction of the church that stood up and fought on the front lines of this thing called the civil rights movement. A lot of Dr. King's messages were sermons that he was preaching and teaching and going throughout the United States, talking about better jobs. He was talking about women's rights. He was talking about the upliftment of Black and brown people. He was talking about the mistreatment of our LGBTQ community. And I'll be honest when I say white supremacy has crept into this Christendom or this purity type of ideology. And when you start to allow your belief to make you look down on somebody, you have lost your way in Christianity. Here's one thing that the great bishop out in Florida, Bishop Rudolph McKissick, taught me a long time ago. He said, Robert, one thing we have to understand is that my religious belief has to come to an understanding against good public policy. And what we are facing here today is we have people who believe in a certain way of doing things. And they believe in having a certain rule or a certain doctrine in doing things. Jesus came to be the light of the world, to be the way, to heal the sick, to heal and give sight to the blind. There was a woman with an issue of blood for 12 years that nobody could help and nobody could touch. There was a man with leprosy who they shunned out and kicked him out of the town. There was this man named Blind Bartimaeus who sat by the road. All of these examples are people who had been kicked out by society. And this man named Jesus, this dark-skinned man with hair like lambs of wool, like nappy hair, and skin as brown as brass, as brass wood. This man then is prosecuted by a federal government that did not like him opening the eyes of those around him to the fact of them being oppressed. That they no longer had to be physically sick because they could also be mentally healed. And so what we find ourselves in right now, Brother Mike, is that there are people who are coming out of this because they feel that white supremacy has crept into the church, and that it has this patriarchal type of way of doing things, and they're tired of it. But I'm here to tell folks that I'm here to represent the church, represent the church that comes into the streets, because we have church every time we march. We have church every time we have a community meeting. We have church every time we help a young man get out of prison. Every time we help somebody. Every time we help feed somebody. Every time we help make sure that someone is getting the mental health services that they need, getting a bed in a hospital that they need. To me, that's where the church resides.
I couldn't agree with you more. I you led me to my question, as a matter of fact, is what can we do? And maybe you've already answered it. What can we do in our individual lives to make these things better as Christian people?
First of all, you got to check yourself, because one thing that we all have to remember is that somebody somewhere has benefited from the system that is in place, and somebody somewhere has been oppressed and degraded because of the system that is in place. So the first thing we have to do, Brother Mike, is check ourselves. Once we've taken a hard look, and that's one of the hardest things to do, is to realize that the folks around you sometimes make racist comments that are uncomfortable, but yet we've become so desensitized to it that we just let it flow. That you got to check yourself, and then you got to check those around you. Because if it's allowed at your dinner table, all it takes is a little seed and then a little bit of water for that thing to start to grow. But if we cut it off the moment that the seed is planted, or we don't allow the seeds of hatred and racism to be planted by telling people that's not funny to talk about this black woman's hair or ask her to touch her hair. That's not funny that this or comment under these news articles that this black man was arrested or something happened to a black family. We have to make sure that we check ourselves and then check those around us. Once we have done that, then we can come out and be a part of organizations like mine and like others, like the NAACP, the ACLU. We can be a part of making a difference. And it's not just by sitting on our couch and saying, oh my God, what happened to George Floyd was wrong because tomorrow is his 1 year anniversary. No, you can get out here, you can tell your elected officials that bills that they have passed in the State House this year are catastrophic to those in minority and low income neighborhoods. You can tell people that this is not right. You can have a voice too, but somebody got to be the Jesus in the room. Why not let it be you?
I understand that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been confronted every now and then by people who are in their early 20s. I'm an older man, Reverend. Do you really think that that entitling young white people to scream at their elders is a good idea?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part. Say that again.
I say, should we empower young white people to start yelling at older people?
I don't empower anybody to yell at anybody. What I empower folks to do is to have kind of open dialogue and conversations about where we are. I saw a viral video of a young lady who was checking her parent.
Right.
And you could tell that the conversation had become very uncomfortable based upon an ideology that is thought of in their home, right? And what was interesting to me is she was pushing back on her parents. And so what we have to get into the mindset of is that folks are going to have differences of opinion. I may not agree with the Democrat all the time. I may not agree with the Republican all the time. I may not agree with the progressive or the liberal or the conservative or the Baptist. I may not agree all the time, but what I can do is we can have a conversation and we can sit down, break bread, and talk to one another and figure out where are we similar. I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'm done, Brother Mike. I was out registering voters during the 2020 election cycle. I was in Storm Lake, Iowa, and an older white man with a "Make America Great Again" hat comes up to me at the Hy-Vee out there, and he has a .45 gun on his hip.
Whoa.
He looked at me and he looks at my partner, Brother Al, and Al is about 6'3", 300 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at us and he says, "What are you boys doing around here?"
Oh God. Oh,
and Brother Al jumps out there, Mike, and he says, "Hey, we're just looking to register voters. You know, that's all we're doing." He looks at us again, Brother Mike, and he says, "What are you boys doing around here?" So at that moment, I looked him in the face, Brother Mike, and I said to him, I said, "Do you have a wife?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have children or grandchildren?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Would you not do anything to make sure that they are okay? Would you not fight for them?" He said, "Oh, I would fight like you know what for them." And I looked at him and I said, "So will I." So one thing for sure that we know about each other right now is that we're going to fight for ours. We're going to fight for our families. And we're going to fight because we want to make sure that they are okay. And it was at that moment, Brother Mike, that we didn't look at each other as opposites, but we looked at each other as humans. Because all we were trying to do, we were both in high V fighting for our family, trying to figure out how do we make it home to them.
You're going to have to explain something to me or try, Reverend.
Please.
Back in the 80s when my son was growing up, black kids would come into the yard to play with other kids. And sometimes they drop the N-bomb on each other. And I'd tell them to knock it off. You don't talk that way in my yard. And nobody uses that word in my yard. And they would argue with me saying it was in their culture. And I'd say, fine, but this is my house. And this is my yard, and you don't use that word. So why is it that young black people seem to have revived this ugly word and made it acceptable somehow within the black culture?
Some people, it's looked at it like this. Some people, and this is some people's belief, I can't speak for the whole culture, but some people don't like it. You know, you have those who are like, no, don't use it, especially some of our older folks. And then you have some of our hipsters and our hip hop generation who have embraced it, or you have others who may use it for whatever reason. But one thing I do know is that a lot of times you'll see somebody in their life, whether they're black, white, Hispanic, they'll take something so negative and try to turn it into something positive around them. They'll take something and try to make it into something that is better fitting for them. I've seen this done so many times from people who have been victimized, people who have been oppressed. If you go back and you look at the kids who were in cages during our last administration, you go back, you could see that in some of the videos they were trying to make the best of the situation in which they were in.
Sure,
they were trying to figure out how do they do this and stay sane. So I can't speak for everybody, but I really believe sometimes it's just about trying to turn a negative into a positive.
Reverend Rob Johnson has been our guest. When are you going to be in town the next time, sir?
So I'll be coming up there pretty soon. It'll probably be sometime in June.
All right. Thank you, sir, for being on the air with us.
Hey, thank you, sir. I'll see you soon.
All right. This is AM 1400 KVFD, the voice of Fort Dodge.
Each week, learn more about precision agriculture, ag data, and the newest technologies on the farm during the special podcast series Within an Inch of Your Farm, presented by John Deere.